Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Flourish FM. Very special because this is the second in a two-part series with Dr. Rick Hanson. Rick Hanson is a psychologist, senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and New York Times bestselling author. His 7 books have been published in 31 languages and include Making Great Relationships, which is the focus of our conversation today, as well as his books Neurodharma, Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Just One Thing, Buddha's Brain, and Mother Nurture, with over 1 million copies sold in English alone. Rick is the founder of the Global Compassion Coalition and the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, as well as the co-host of the Being Well podcast, which has been downloaded over 15 million times. His free newsletters have 250,000 subscribers, and his online programs have scholarships available for those with financial needs. Rick has lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard. He's an expert on positive neuroplasticity, and his work has been featured in major media outlets including CBS, NPR, and the BBC. He began meditating in 1974 and has taught in meditation centers worldwide. In the first part of this two-part series, we discussed Rick's work on mindfulness, neuroplasticity, and hardwiring for happiness, and the focus on that one of his books in particular. We also discussed his work on resilience, how to cope with stress and trauma, stress management, and recovery from trauma. In the second part of this two-part series, we focus on Rick's work on relationships and well-being, particularly as he puts forward his work in his most recent book, Making Great Relationships, Simple Practices for Solving Conflicts, Building Connection, and Fostering Love. At the core of that book is the claim that relationships are made rather than given, which, as Rick points out in the book, is supported by thousands of scientific studies. And we discuss some of the key scientific findings that Rick describes in that book and then puts forward relationship practices based on those scientific findings. We talk about neuroscience behind building strong relationships, the connection between social connection and well-being. And in the book, there are 50 simple and powerful practices to build happy, lasting, and fulfilling relationships. And we discuss, we give some examples of those practices and discuss how it is that Rick identified those and how they kind of draw upon the wealth of research that Rick describes in the book. These practices are informed by Rick's extensive experience as a psychologist and a therapist, as well as other areas of expertise. And the book describes fundamentals for any relationship, which you can apply in any setting. For example, healing old wounds and finding support in your relationships as they are. We discuss some of these key fundamentals for a relationship. What are the fundamentals for any relationship, and how did Rick identify these, and how can we cultivate these? It's a fascinating conversation. We hope you love it. This is the second part of our two-part conversation with Dr. Rick Hanson.
Hello, gents.
There he is. Good to see you again, Rick.
Good to see you both as well.
It's the first time I think we've ever said welcome back.
Yeah, we're honored. Yeah, this is fun. This is fun. How you doing? How have you been since we last connected?
I've been really good. I've been at a human level, and it's recording, whatever. I've just been really interested in practicing with exasperation. Think about all the little things in life where, for example, you're trying to walk out of a store and 2 people are standing in the door talking with each other, or in your family settings, things happen that you've talked about previously and they happen again, or in your politics, like American politics.
Sure.
Good. And exasperation is a really interesting thing to practice with because, of course, it can be there. It can be fueled by righteousness. It tends to be very self-referential in a Buddhist practice kind of sense. And anyway, it's good. And I'm a fairly mellow, privileged person. I have less cause for exasperation than many people, of course. Anyway, so that's kind of top of mind. I'll just drop that in here for whatever it's worth.
Okay. Maybe that'll come up today. It's probably not a far cry to suggest that relationships could be exasperating.
Well, I mean, I think you said we'd started recording. I think we could just dive in here. So
we just go. Yeah, we all know what we're doing. Yeah, let's do it.
But I think we would include what you've just said, Rick, actually, and take that right into a first question, I think mentioned. So has your lower feeling of exasperation been a result of you applying any of your practices for making great relationships?
Well, it's good. It's humbling to think about the classic structure: approach, avoid, promote, prevent. That dichotomy. I personally think that dichotomy, for complicated reasons, including patriarchy, has been too binary, and there's actually a third major motivational system that we have: to attach. So we have avoiding harm, approaching reward, attaching to others, especially in mammals and really primates and very much so humans, that attaching is a meaningful thing. Okay, so
what's the flip, Rick? Isolate?
Oh, that's very well. What do you mean? So you avoid harms, you approach rewards,
avoid,
you attach,
right?
Attach to others. Attach to others.
Right. But if it's approach, avoid, right? Attach, I would assume, is the approach behavior. What's the avoidance behavior on the
very
social
good.
level? Or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, they're not the way it's understood. Motivational psychology is that there's, if you will, a pole or range of avoidance from very little to a lot. Yep. And then there's an independent pole or continuum, really, a range of degrees of approaching. And the question is whether our deeply social nature can be entirely deconstructed into some arithmetic of avoiding pain and approaching pleasure. And that's how it's been constructed, typically, in both Western psychology and in the Buddhist psychological tradition. And my view is that they're actually, particularly in terms of brain evolution and common sense, both, there's a third major motivational system that cannot be deconstructed entirely into some combination of, as I said, avoiding pain and approaching pleasure. That has to do with our loyalty to others, the ways in which we are motivated to care for others in ways that transcend the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure, which has a lot of implications for how we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves basically as big lizards, avoiding pain and, approaching pleasure, or do we see ourselves in more complex ways? And I think actually we need to do that. And all that said, as we are going through life, certain experiences are aversive. So I'm now going to go back to that simple binary model. Certain experiences are aversive, right? Exasperation is an aversive experience. We don't like it. Something bugs us. We're annoyed by it. Maybe we're frustrated by it. And then there are experiences that are more pleasurable, more enjoyable. We like those kinds of experiences. Anyway, so that's what I'm saying so far. And then with regard to aversion, because of the brain's negativity bias, aversion for most people is more motivating than desire, if you will, or desire is the wrong word. Pleasure, enjoyment. In the Buddhist language, it would be greed or grasping. Right? So aversion is very consequential. And there is a lot of research on the impact of creating aversive experiences in other people. They tend to have much more impact than creating pleasant experiences, like with you all, right? I think so far I've avoided any big aversive experiences for you. And we've had we've had a lot of good ones. But if I was to suddenly, kind of speak sharply towards you, or suddenly sort of get on your case about something, or, be irritated with you, whoa, that would have a lot of impact. Yeah. So that's why it's really important to pay attention to negative experiences for other people, and pay particular attention, of course, to them for ourselves. And so exasperation, annoyance, right? Those are kind of mild, but really useful things to notice in the subtlety of our interactions with other people. They often just go right by because we feel so justified in our exasperation, right? And it feeds into that kind of righteous case we make about others. They shouldn't do that, or they mistreated me, or they mistreated others. Just we believe it so quickly. So personal practice is first to be mindful of subtleties of exasperation rising, and then instead of acting them out, explore, what's their basis? And often when I explore what the basis is, I realize it's not that big a deal. Or this other person is really well-intended. They're just doing something here that I don't like, but whatever. They're well-intended. You just slow it down, and then often the exasperation just dissolves altogether. Occasionally, you look inside and you go, there's really a thing here, and it's appropriate for me to stand up for myself. And in standing up for myself, there are probably more skillful, frankly, and better odds ways of communicating than leading with exasperation, which for the person on the receiving end is an aversive experience. They're going to get exasperated. You're exasperated. How dare you, right? So there are probably better ways to communicate about it. I don't know. What do you think about that riff there? How do you relate to it?
It makes me think about something I really want to ask you about today, but we won't get to that question yet. But something that's been a recurrent theme on this podcast so many times, the role of negative experiences in inverted commas. What exactly is a negative experience? Negative emotions in areas of well-being that relate to flourishing, but here context is building relationships, right? So when you feel a negative emotion, that's straightforward use of the term negative. Exasperation, for example, frustration, anger, resentment, perhaps not hatred, that's maybe too strong, but anger and so on. What role positively does that play in the building of a relationship? When I think of my closest relationships, they are ones that have definitely involved exasperation on multiple occasions, right? The ones that are free from anything negative are often not the stronger ones. And you can imagine,
interesting.
You can imagine all kinds of reasons for this, right? You spend more time with those people in a variety of contexts, a variety of times of the day. Maybe you've been on holiday with them, whatever, so they're going to see you at your worst or your best. There's all these kinds of reasons. But when you make up for those bad experiences with someone, when you patch things over, as it were, when you apologize, the relationship does seem to be built. So, I guess the way I'd like to go with this, Rick, is to ask whether you think negative experiences, negative emotions like exasperation play a really important role in building great relationships.
What an interesting reflection. And it gets at, I think, the priors. In other words, to what extent are significant relationships in which there are greater stakes on the table? We care more. So it matters more what other people do, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do wonder about the degree to which we can become exasperated with the behavior of strangers, getting on and off a subway, cutting in the line, comments on social media, trolls of various kinds. In our home in America, we get probably 5 to 10 spam calls a day, robocalls trying to sell us something, and so that's invasive and so forth. We'd probably get more if we didn't have a little device that recognizes that phone number and permanently blocks it going forward. So I wonder about that, right? And then you're getting at, okay, if we can repair that which exasperates us or hurts us, maybe we feel hurt, let down, perhaps. Then if we can repair, that makes a stronger relationship, much like a bone that's broken and then reknits is stronger at the point of reknitting. I think that's a very beautiful way to look at it. And it's a way to frame the so-called negative emotions are not anger. Exasperation is a kind of anger, right? The big four basically is the spectrum, the range of anger, fear, sadness, and shame on the range. So we're talking about mainly the anger spectrum here. It's a way to kind of frame those as they're not bad. And it's really important to be alert to their particular potency in relationships and to really highlight as well the importance of repair. That's how I understand what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I certainly wasn't claiming that, the only kinds of relationships that are really good ones, the ones that have negative emotions. Because there's all these bad relationships that have bad emotional experiences, like the ones you've mentioned. I guess, but it seems to me though that it's hard to think of great relationships that haven't involved a reasonably significant degree of some negative emotional experiences directed at the other person that you've learned how to manage, cope with, recover from. Like a parent, for example, right? Or a sibling. It's great examples.
Yeah, I think it's complex. My aunt, bless her, no longer here, Vicky, grew up on a ranch in North Dakota with my father. She married her childhood sweetheart, who came from the same kind of rural, white, Midwestern Christian Methodist kind of community. They lived together for many, many years, raised 3 children. He died eventually, and then she passed away about 10 years later. And after he had died, we were talking one time, and she said, well, your Uncle Fred and I, we literally never fought. And I believe that's true. Yeah. They went to the same church. They were in kind of a monoculture. They were supported. They didn't have things to fight about. They both got lucky, in their choice of each other. So I think there might be some folks like that.
Yeah.
Let's see. That's one point. And then the other point related to what you're saying here, I think, is to ask ourselves, of course, how are we knitting our relationships together when life, rust never sleeps, right? Entropy doesn't stop. They tend to keep fraying the fabric of a relationship. And how do we keep reknitting a relationship so that it stays good?
You familiar with any lines of research along these lines? Like I don't know what the language would be, but it seems to me some sort of comparative study of relationships of quote unquote richness versus kind of unbridled positivity or pleasant affect, right? And that like if basically these relationships, and we're being very general here, right? We could probably be more granular and categorical, like family versus friendship versus intimate are going to have some different dynamics. But just curious if you're familiar with anything that's looked at some type of comparison like that.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, really. I'm familiar with bodies of research that get at aspects of that. So on the one hand, there's the very well-developed body of research from the Gottmans and others that talk about the highly potent impact of negative interactions in proportion to positive interactions. Yeah. And there was some controversy about their initial number, that there needs to be 5-to-1 ratio. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But there's that piece of work. There's also a body of work about different culture. For example, my aunt and uncle, it would be enormously consequential for someone to raise their voice across a dinner table. That would be so unusual. It would just land like a ton of bricks. On the other hand, think of other cultures, whoa, whoa, a lot of hand waving, a lot of yelling, a lot of interrupting. It's normative, right? And when you're the new boyfriend or girlfriend brought into that family system, who comes from a different culture, just sort of sits quietly and waits.
I've been that guy actually. Laughing. I suppose it's okay to talk about this in the podcast. Yeah, an ex-girlfriend from the Mediterranean. Like, are you guys all right? The way you're talking to me on the phone and so on, is everything okay? Oh yeah. Daily conversation.
Yeah. So there's that, and then there is this really interesting stuff about what's called optimal distance. I don't know if you've had guests talking about that in terms of attachment theory and so forth. So basically, a child who is avoidantly attached is attached at a distance. Okay. And then you can see adults who connect with each other and they maintain the relationship. They don't abandon each other or just leave the relationship. They stay in that relationship, a friendship, let's say, a romantic relationship, but they really regulate the distance. And so if you think about these two movements in us, closeness and distance, and you can think of this kind of moment to moment dance of that on a time scale of literally seconds, uh, you can see the ways in which people tend to find an optimal distance. Some people, they want to be really close, some people really at arm's length. And that then takes us into, to your question there, Nick, the ways in which there's this term called distance in the service of attachment.
Okay.
In other words, we maintain the attachment by keeping a certain distance. And one of the ways to create that distance, to go back to what you said there, John, is through negative affect. People who, I know people who bond through bickering. Bickering is for them a mode of attachment. Low-grade exasperation with each other, eye rolls, head shakes. That's how they connect. And I'm really not talking about make-up sex, where maybe it's really good after a certain fight. I'm talking about things that develop as long-term equilibriums. That tends to happen in relationships. We form equilibriums of one kind or another, including larger systems like families or groups. Then the question is what's the nature of that equilibrium and what tends to maintain it? And maybe to some extent, a certain amount of negative affect, let's say exasperation, irritation, squabbling, helps another person remain your friend because they don't know what to do when you don't squabble with them. It's a familiar script. Then the question, of course, is, are there other maybe better ways to get the result that's sought? Like for the person who's distancing, they want to maintain autonomy. They don't want to be exploited. They don't want to be plundered. Think about dwarves with deep riches inside, but many walls, right, to protect the inner treasure chest. Can we give people the reassurance that we're not going to dominate them, we're not going to plunder them, and we're not going to suck them into emotional material that's just, way too vulnerable and intense for them, so that they can, in other words, we're in a way distancing ourselves to reassure them that they can start coming forward. And that's a dynamic I see a lot, where often in couples, you'll have the pursuer and the distancer. You'll have the, person who's highly focused on autonomy and the person who's highly focused on intimacy. Sometimes it tracks gender in terms of common stereotypes. Often it doesn't. So what do you do then? And how can the person who's really focused on autonomy reassure the other person that they are interested in making emotional connections with them and meeting their intimacy needs? Flip the other way, how can the person who's more focused on joining and intimacy needs reassure the person who's more like me, prickly about autonomy, growing up with controlling, fault-finding parents who loved me dearly, how can my wife, who grew up in a unusually sane home, curse her because she doesn't understand me deeply sometimes. But anyway, how can she, reassure me that she's not going to, overwhelm me or boss me around? Yeah. So I don't know. These are interesting complications. What do you make of some of this stuff?
I don't know. I'm just curious about. And again, I think it probably depends on the type of relationship, but where my head went was, for a previous series, I had a conversation with Lydia Denworth, who 2-3 years ago, I don't know if you know her work at all. She does some writing for Scientific American, among other spaces. But the book is basically on the biology of friendship. And it kind of simultaneously traces these monkey studies with what we know about, from human studies as well. And one of the things she mentions in the book, and we talked about during that conversation, was that like the kind of like strongest and best friendships in this case is just specifically about friendships, if I understood it all correctly, typically are almost unmitigated positive regard. Like ambivalence in a good friendship isn't really much of a thing. Not just ambivalence, but like if there's even some of these inklings to a certain extent of, and I want to be careful here because I don't know that that necessarily means unpleasantness between the two people can't exist. Maybe it's the way it's framed during and after the fact, right? But that's just where my head went. Is it seemed like, oh, maybe is that a contradiction? And I was curious, or maybe those things coexist, or maybe it depends on whether you're talking about friendships versus partners. But like you said, this is all complex. It could be attachment style as well. It's just kind of a variable that popped into my head.
Yeah. How about your friendships? Would you, if you think about interactions and you were to sort your interactions with, your kind of top 3 or 5 friends, interactions into 3 piles from your perspective, and maybe even from the other person's perspective, but basically positive, neutral, negative. Ish. What's the distribution probably of those piles? What's the relative size?
Yeah, there's few to none and negative. Because I'm not great about keeping up anyway. So if it's negative, it ain't happening. Like positive is hard enough already. That's right. Positive's hard enough as it is for my personality type. But yeah, I think there's, whether it's confirmation bias or not, but that would tend to follow that trend. Like, it doesn't mean that there haven't been moments of exasperation or annoyance or frustration. Like, these are longtime roommates and people, like, John was saying, that you end up in situations with where there's some unpleasantness, but that seems to be kind of some of the fabric of that bond that's been woven over the course of these, like I said, rich experiences, if not affectively pleasant all the time.
Yeah. How about you, John?
Yeah, it's really interesting what Nick said about Denworth's research on this. And I'm trying to figure out how I would pair that with my intuition, or at least my experience, that my close relationships, and we should maybe put that claim is about friendship, right? So let's put family aside. My closest friendships are definitely those where there have been some difficult experiences. Sometimes, really difficult experiences where the friendship's been threatened, as it were, but we've overcome it. And where I have friendships where there's never been that at all, it's often because I haven't maybe spent that much time with the person. So there hasn't been the opportunity for that. We haven't had that
shallow,
richer set of experiences. And I can't amplify my own experience to that being a claim. But when I think about people I know as well and their closest friends, there's been lots of strife between them. Often because they've known each other through so many periods of life. There's been so much change and some difficult times they've had to help each other out with, where maybe someone hasn't been in the best mood, best state of mind, been quite irritable. Maybe, for example, they've been burned out or depressed or something, gone through a breakup and they've been helped out there, but they haven't been, in their best state of mind. So there've been arguments as a result of that. And arguments, emotional arguments are never pleasant. So I can't help but think that there's a strong place for at least some negative emotional experiences in building a stronger bond.
Yeah, interesting. So we have 2 different with you two guys, 2 different kind of models of relating, right? And that's interesting. And I think that's probably, a very normal range. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I need to add a lot of things to that to turn it into some kind of theory, right? So it would need to be that, like, the negative experiences were about something meaningful, not just trivial matters. That you were just arguing about trivial things,
Yeah,
and it's like, look, I can't. This is just not really working as a friendship, for example, because we argue about the most trivial things.
We had an example, John. I think. You're going right where I was going, which is like, Rick, in between our conversations or right around the same time, we had Amy Edmondson on. And I don't know if you and Amy know each other, but like the concept of psychological safety, and she laid out a lot of similar things that we're talking about here. I think, John, like, maybe this is good alignment to what you're saying, but this is another category or group that's slightly different to kind of add to the fray, which is typically colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They kind of blur that line sometimes with friends, You get referred to as family, which is utterly absurd. But they're this clear, distinct category. And what we were going through is like, okay, so psychological safety has to be generally the equilibrium for teams, groups to really thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But reaching the richness of, let's call it, psychological safety in these settings typically is not a trajectory that's only pleasant at all times.
Mm.
Right. And so what that might look like is arguing over the best strategy, the best mode of execution, who's the right people responsible for different parts of that execution. John, sorry, I'm getting to this in a long way, but to your point, like that's a potential example of the unpleasantness existing for a clear purpose, like something that's ultimately unifying, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Assuming that purpose is in place, in the first place, of course, right?
Yeah. So we then connect that up with friendship outside of a work setting or outside of being colleagues, in that there's a shared purpose, or in the sense that both parties or several parties have a deep interest in the friendship growing and lasting. And so there's an attempt to reconcile things through these difficult experiences. Perhaps there's comfortability expressing negative emotions around someone you're close with, because you want them to help you out, maybe calm down, reason with, why you're feeling this way, and you're comfortable acting in that way around them, in a way that, I'm much more comfortable acting in a much richer set of emotional states around my closest friends and family than I am around people I don't know very well, right? Because I feel they won't judge me so much. I feel they'll understand, and so on. And I hope they feel the same way. So is that the kind of connection you're pointing out, Nick?
Yeah, I think it could be. Yeah, I think there's a variety of examples. Yeah.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
Yeah. How much do you focus on, this kind of goes, I guess, to my book, Making Great Relationships. How much do you focus on your own inner qualities and also outer behavior, but especially inner attitudes, let's say, or qualities in terms of relationships? Like, for example, something I've paid a lot of attention to, particularly as this research on negativity bias and the differential impact of negative interactions, I started paying a lot more attention to a kind of subtlety of, irritability, accelerating, velocity, intensity, pointing out how things could be better, blah, blah, and a lot of stuff that I thought, gee, I'm a nice guy from California. I'm a mellow, aging hippie, all of which is basically true. And even aging hippies, right, can just leak a certain amount of exasperation and pushiness that just comes through. right? And you may not even realize it. So I've spent a certain amount of time, looking inside. What's going on there for me? To what extent am I enacting the style I grew up with my parents, who were both quite critical in their various different ways? So that's something I've looked at inside myself. And I've also looked at the broad cultivation of a kind of almost universal goodwill that radiates out, which includes appropriate boundary setting with people moving through that field. But that field of broad goodwill is not dependent on the behavior of others. The scope of my relationship with them and whether I, have lunch with them again or something, that could depend on what they actually do. Anyway, so those are examples of things I've looked at inside myself. How about both of you?
I'm always self-monitoring.
Yeah. Like, what do you monitor? What have you guided?
It depends on the relationship. But irritability resonated for sure.
Yeah.
Is certain impatience.
Yeah. Impatience. I can relate to that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And have you helped yourself shift those traits over time, not just regulate those states?
Oh, interesting. Move it from state regulation more to a trait, some automaticity. Yeah. Movement. Yeah. Is it where ideally, you're always striving, but sure. Movement.
The Dalai Lama talks about give it 5 years and, measure progress on that kind of larger time span, right? We may not be able to see it across 3 weeks, but maybe over 5 years we can see it. Yeah. Yeah. Shifting of traits. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Like Nick, I'm not sure you are excessively, Nick, but I'm constantly self-reflecting on these things to the point where I try to do it less, actually. But I mean, the reason I paused to think was this is in the context of building relationships, right? Or in relation to relationships. And actually, I do that a great deal too, particularly with people I intend to build stronger connections with. But I've over time, I worry less and less and less about things that I used to think were mistakes in interactions, especially when it comes to things like online interactions, like email, Slack, whatever it might be, when you're like, did that come across as rude or something? Now I switch off very quickly from that. And interpersonally too, I do as well. I'm like, did I say that the wrong way? And I'm like, wait, no, they probably didn't care. Don't worry about it. Move on. Whereas I used to let that stuff bother me a great deal. And it's very rare that these things I think bother other people actually do, I think, because they never get mentioned again, or, they just don't seem to concern us like they concern me.
Yeah. People let them go by. When I was taking acid, LSD back in the day, internally I thought, oh my God, everybody in the world has got to realize that I'm tripping, including this, police officer is giving me a ticket.
Sure.
But no, they didn't. On the whole, it was like, wow. You know what I mean? So, if we're stumbling drunk, obviously people are going to notice that sort of thing. But very often they're just, our internal state is not that apparent to other people, et cetera.
Yeah. Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's look. This is absolutely fascinating, Rick. We want to make sure that we cover some of the key areas of your book, because we could end up talking for hours about our self-analysis here for sure. And it's very kind of you to offer your deep analysis.
I'm with you
on the call. But let's.
I'm having a similar one. I'm disclosing pretty thoroughly here.
Awesome. Let's make sure we cover some of the key areas of your work on great relationships. So for listeners, your newest book is Making Great Relationships, Simple Practices for Solving Conflicts, Building Connection, and Fostering Love. And interestingly, the book describes fundamentals for any relationship, which you can apply to any setting, such as we've discussed, healing old wounds and also finding support in your relationships. So perhaps we've touched on some of these already. Mm-hmm. But what are the fundamentals for any relationship, and how did you identify these?
That's a big two-part question. So I'll try to give you a
that'll be the rest of our time basically on that
answer. So first, I did it out of my own background, and people can judge it on its merits. As a 50-year couples counselor, relationship counselor, coach, longtime marriage, and the rest of that. And I'm deeply rooted in developmental psychology, attachment theory, social psychology, and so forth. And it just seemed to me that there, first of all, is the simple fact that we have a lot of influence over the nature of our relationships. And I say that because very often where people start, in my experience, is they feel helpless, overpowered, or they don't know what to do to nudge their important relationships in a better direction. So right off the top, just to realize that we do have a lot of influence through what we think, what we say, and what we do, and how our relationships take shape over time. And if we have thoroughly and skillfully and appropriately done what we can think and say and do, and the relationship is still a mess, then increasingly it's clear that that's about the other person and not you. Okay, so that's point one. You have tremendous power, tremendous influence, and one of the most important forms of that influence is the cultivation of who we are being. You know, I think, who was it? Heidegger maybe said being precedes becoming, you know, and what's your basic state of being? You know, are you relatively calm in your being? Are you relatively loving in your being? Do you have a genuine curiosity and interest in other people? They can palpably feel it when they're around you or not, right? What is your state of being? And so the gradual cultivation in ways that you're both familiar with and your listeners too, of, you know, a growing sense of well-being, resilient well-being, you know, is a major thing we can do in our relationships. The more that we feel that we're running on empty, the more that there are no more brake pads inside us, it's metal on metal, us and the world, well, then we're much more likely to create trouble in our relationships, and it's much harder to create good ones. So, you know, the cultivation of resilient well-being is important, as well as the clarity that you really do have influence. And then after that, I think attention to the impact of needlessly negative interactions with other people, that's really useful. The development over time of problem solving and making new agreements with people, whether it's what it takes to create a safe working environment or what it takes to have a family kind of running on an even keel, or, you know, long-term relationship. What are our understandings with each other so that we can actually work through conflicts and move to repair? All right. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really essential. Being reserving the right to resize your relationships as you choose, to the extent you can. There's certain relationships where we have a duty, let's say, to a dementing parent, or, you know, we're stuck with an ex and we've got to raise our 6-year-old together for the next 15 years at least. You know, then we have certain constraints on how much we can resize them. But to say for yourself, you know, you really do have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to step back. You have the right to see that person less often or not at all, you know, if you possibly can, and it's safe to do that. That's important, because then it gives you the reassurance that last, you can do something that I think is way underrated, particularly in Western culture, Western fast-paced industrial culture, which is speaking from the heart. Way underrated. And I can say that from very personal experience. So many relationship problems that I've had in my history really would have been nipped in the bud if I'd been willing at the time to speak from my heart in an honest and vulnerable way, which might have included, like, wow, I'm really unhappy with how this is going here. That's speaking from the heart. Or another might be something like, well, what you said there, I felt hurt. You know, I felt let down, and rather than, you know, going to war with that other person, for example, or intellectualizing or acting all cool and indifferent, and yet forever after that relationship is, you know, there's been a breach in it and it's taken a bad turn. So those would be some of my headlines. I don't know if any of them are particularly interesting to you.
All of them. Yeah. The question is, which one should we pick on to dig deeper? in the time we have. I mean, is there any one of those that you think is especially important to cultivate?
Well, as people can check out the book, and it's got 50 short chapters. Each of them is about 3 pages long. I was once complimented on a radio show in a funny kind of way, about a previous book like this one with very short chapters. He said, "Doc, I don't want to insult you, but this is a really good bathroom book," because each chapter is really short. So I'm okay with that. And the chapters, are framed in the language of a practice, a thing you can actually do. You're making improvements in your relationships. One that comes to mind is admit fault and move on.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty direct.
Mm-hmm.
Speak from the heart. That's another one. Speak wisely. There's certain classic criteria or characteristics of speech that is wise. In the book, I borrow on Buddhist psychology for the 6 criteria, the 6 characteristics. 5 are required, 1 is optional. Speech is wise, and this is a good little checklist, especially when we get into trouble with somebody, right? If everything's going fine, we can freestyle, no big. But if things start getting weird, you want to move back into good form. And speech is wise. See for yourself if it is well-intended, true, which just means that we don't speak falsely. We don't say everything that's true. We can be judicious, but what we do say is actually true as far as we know about it. We don't deliberately lie. 3 is beneficial in its results for them or for you. Sometimes they don't want to hear it. I'll get to that in a minute, but it's important for you to get it off your chest, to say what it's like for you, to go on record, to know that you've spoken truth to power, let's say, even if it doesn't make a difference. Okay. Also, timely. We don't drop the bomb on people when they're walking out the door or just before bed. And then also, this is a very important one, tone, that the tone is not harsh. Now, as we said earlier, for my aunt and uncle, coming out of North Dakota, harsh tone is going to be judged very differently than a hand waving, highly intense, I don't know what that culture might be, kind of family. That's going to be really different. But basically, you stay inside the lines and you kind of, when we've started to move outside the lines there. So those are the 5. And then the 6th one that's desirable but optional is speech is wise, that's desired. And I think about as a parent of teenagers, when they were teenagers, that, there's a certain amount of things that I wanted to say that they didn't want to hear. And it was okay for me to be silent for a while. But there were times, on the other hand, where they didn't want to hear it, but I had to say it. And then, right? Even if I paid a price for that in some way, in terms of my duties as a parent. So anyway, those are examples of, some of the very specific things that we can actually do, that can make things better in our relationships, like admitting fault and moving on, making clear agreements, and, speaking in skillful ways.
Mm-hmm. That list of 6, just to clarify, is different from the 6 parts of the book, right? Because you have your 50,
that's correct.
Just to clarify for listeners, that because one of them is overlapping, speak wisely. So
is that the name of that part?
Yeah, there's a part of so you have the 50 practices over the book to build great relationships, which is divided across 6 parts. Befriend yourself, warm the heart, be at peace with others, stand up for yourself, speak wisely,
right,
and love the world. So there's one overlap there. But the 6 criteria you just described, the six criteria you just described are kind of the 6 steps of building great relationships, but the practices are divided over 6 kind of rubrics, if you like.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you could just think about the last interactions that did not go well, or what might things go better, what might make things go better in key situations. And very often we actually know, right, what helps things go well and what makes them go badly. And then the question becomes, can we train in those ways of being? so that we're more effective with people.
I think that's kind of where, and maybe this can serve sort of as a final question, or at least start to wrap here. We'll see where it takes us. But in terms of like the flow or the hierarchy of questions one might reflect on to enhance social connection, right?
Yeah.
So if anyone that's listened for a while or has heard of at least a handful of episodes is going to hear a guest or us say, single greatest predictor of just about everything good, right? Well-being and life satisfaction, fulfillment and purpose and all that sort of stuff, social connection, right? So really, really important. You've hammered home, I think, a lot of specific things that you might do. But before you even get to that, it seems to me there's a question of who do I focus on? And what type of relationships do I need? And do I need to sort of be more conscious of? And so I guess I'm kind of asking, how might somebody even get started with, do I need more from family connections? Am I not paying enough attention to professional relationships, right? Is there something missing or adequate or that needs to be changed in my intimate relationship, right? Before they even get to the action steps themselves, it's almost, not to be crass about it, but kind of a social scoreboard, if you will.
So interesting. Several things. So first, I think it is helpful for people to look at the domains of their life and ask themselves, how resourced are they interpersonally in those different domains?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes what will come forward is people will realize, I've got some good, dear friends, and wow, I could sure use some mentors in my work. Or wow, I really need to build up some allies here at work to deal with this problem I've got. And I need to invest more there. Flip the other way. Yeah. People they have friends, but that developmental task of finding a life partner just has not really yet clicked for them. And there's luck involved in that, other factors, but what could they do to increase the odds of that, being a good result for them? So that's certainly true, I think, there. The other thing I want to mention, though, is in terms of the cliche that is widely stated, you were basically quoting it, that relationships are the single biggest thingamajigger. Well, they're of the major factors of individual well-being, they probably get the highest box score. In other words, more people will report that, but many people will report that there are other major factors of well-being that frankly have more consequence for them than their relationship.
Of course.
Yeah. So, and it's the problem with language in the social sciences. Like you can make a generalization about every molecule of water, and it's H2O, very straightforward. But language generalizes, right? So people report results of studies that are really about distributions that have a lot of variance, a lot of heterogeneity, but there's sort of the average of it all. So then that becomes the overarching label for everyone in that distribution, even though it doesn't totally fit. And
of course.
So it's helpful for the introverts in the world and also the people who are really interested in non-human objects and animals. They're deeply engaged in that. Their relationships are okay, but what really matters to them is being in wilderness, for example. That's it. Then, if speaking from having been in a room with a lot of people who, to your point there, Nick, are talking about their relationships not being fulfilling. They're not flourishing in their relationships. They don't feel that. Or I'm dealing with a couple. They're in the room, and bingo. I'll tell you a couple of things I've just seen again and again. One has to do with the courage to be open, to be vulnerable, to be real, to say what's been unsaid, to deliver the undelivered communications. That's a really big variable for people to increase that kind of courage. A. B, I think it would also really help many, many kinds of relationships to be more receptive to the other person, to create more space for them, to really let them land empathically in your heart and with you, like, oh, wow, what's it like to be you, right, over there? And to give them, as Dan Siegel put it, the gift of feeling felt. And you can almost think of those as sort of seemingly opposed, the courage to be more assertive and also more open might seem opposed to the receptivity, to another person and a willingness to see the good in them and to rest in an appreciation of them, right? Mm-hmm. But I've seen it's kind of like they actually feed each other in a way. And claiming both of those, I think, are big headlines.
Very good. Thank you.
Awesome.
I've got to jump in 3 minutes for a client.
So
we need to actually wrap. I'm so deeply appreciative of the second hour that you spent with us here and being able to spend time just on relationships. It's just been, I told you when we met the first time, I've been a fan, but it's just been really nice to connect with you. And, sometimes you don't meet your heroes or people you look up to.
That's very kind.
Sometimes you should. And this was the latter. So we appreciate it. Yeah.
Well, I appreciated both of you being willing to dance with me in the very beginning because I was kind of a little bit like popcorn. So,
it was great. Yeah, it was good. It was fun. Yeah.
It's been amazing, Rick. RickHanson.com is your website where people can find out about all your wonderful work, your wonderful books, your amazing work. Thank you so much for 2 wonderful conversations on well-being, drawing upon your vast expertise and experience in these areas.
Oh, thank you both. And thank you both for what you do in the world. Really. Part of appreciating is really, you don't have to do this. You're doing it and you're helping a lot of people.
We hope so.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks for the time, Rick.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog. And every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.